Society tells you proximity to family equals security in your twilight years. Wrong. What appears as safety often becomes a prison of diminished autonomy. You're trading your hard-earned independence for a role that shrinks your existence. Men over 65 are abandoning their psychological sovereignty daily, becoming shadows in their children's lives. Why living close to your children in old age could be a big mistake isn't just advice, it's a warning. Your dignity demands careful consideration. The path of least resistance leads downward. It's on you to maintain your standing. Picture an old lion, once the master of his territory, now pacing a small enclosure. The walls don't protect him, they diminish him. This is what happens when senior men position themselves too close to their adult children, mistaking proximity for security. I've watched countless men in their 70s and 80s shrink before my eyes, not from age, but from surrendering their dominion. The dependency trap emerges slowly, almost imperceptibly. You move closer just in case, a reasonable precaution. Then one day your daughter insists on driving you to appointments. Next, your son questions your financial decisions. The safety net you sought becomes a web that entangles your autonomy. This isn't theoretical. It's the precise psychological mechanism of incremental dependency that diminishes men who've spent decades as providers and decision makers. Jung would call this the shadow side of the archetypal father-child relationship. When proximity inverts the natural order, the psychological impact is profound. The father archetype requires sovereignty to maintain dignity. When you surrender this sovereignty voluntarily, you're not just changing your address, you're rewiring the foundational relationship dynamics that defined your adult life. Let me be clear about the psychological consequences. Your brain is wired to maintain control over your environment. When that control transfers to your children, your neurological reward systems begin to atrophy. Studies in neuroplasticity show that independence stimulates cognitive function. Dependency accelerates cognitive decline. It's not just about pride, it's about your brain's fundamental need for agency and purpose. Now consider the identity sacrifice that occurs. A man I counseled, we'll call him Richard, moved next door to his daughter's family. Within months he wasn't Richard anymore. He was grandpa available for childcare, household repairs, and emotional support. His hobbies abandoned. His friendships faded, his identity compressed into a supporting role in someone else's narrative. The psychological term for this is role engulfment, when one aspect of your identity consumes all others. This identity compression isn't merely uncomfortable, it's existentially threatening. Your sense of self requires multiplicity. You need to be more than one thing to maintain psychological health. When proximity reduces you to a single role, your cognitive flexibility diminishes, your conversational range narrows, your world literally becomes smaller. The autonomy paradox represents perhaps the most insidious aspect of this arrangement. The closer you live to your children, the more your decisions become entangled with theirs. What begins as convenience, "Dad, since you're so close, could you?" evolves into expectation. These micro-compromises accumulate, creating a pattern of deference that erodes your decisional authority. Consider how our ancestors handled aging. The tribal elder maintained separate quarters, but remained accessible for counsel. There was wisdom in this arrangement. Physical separation preserved the psychological boundaries necessary for respect. When you collapse these boundaries through proximity, you inadvertently dismantle the very respect you've earned through decades of life experience. The truth is that meaningful connection paradoxically requires separation. When everything is available, nothing is valued. When you become an everyday fixture in your children's lives, the preciousness of your presence diminishes. Think about it. The visits that mean the most are those that require effort. Distance creates value. Proximity creates habituation. This autonomy must be fiercely protected, especially as you age. It isn't selfish. It's necessary for maintaining the psychological structures that support your dignity and purpose. Moving too close to your children isn't just a practical decision. It's a fundamental repositioning of your existence in relation to those who once depended on you. And that, my friends, requires more careful consideration than most men give it. I once observed a family gathering where the patriarch sat silent while his adult children debated whether he should continue driving. He lived 3 doors down. The proximity that seemed convenient had transformed into a prison of scrutiny. His face revealed the painful truth. Closeness had become suffocation. The boundary problem emerges as the first critical consequence when you plant yourself too close to your children's lives. Proximity creates accessibility. and accessibility inevitably creates entitlement. Your time, your space, your decisions all become subject to casual oversight. This isn't malicious. It's the natural human tendency to expand control over what's readily available. From a psychological perspective, boundaries serve an essential function in human relationships. They define where one person ends and another begins. When physical boundaries collapse through proximity, psychological boundaries inevitably follow. Your children begin consulting you less and informing you more. Dad, we've decided to handle your doctor appointments this way. Not from disrespect, but from the unconscious reframing of you as an extension of their household rather than a sovereign individual. Consider what happens neurologically. Your brain responds to boundary violations with stress hormones, cortisol, and adrenaline. Chronic boundary intrusion creates chronic stress. This manifests as irritability, sleep disturbance, and cognitive decline. Your body literally protests the erosion of your autonomy. The expectation gap represents another insidious burden that develops when living near your children. You expect occasional assistance. They expect constant availability. You expect respect for your routines. They expect flexibility around their schedules. The unspoken assumptions multiply until disappointment becomes inevitable. I worked with a man who moved to his son's neighborhood after retirement. Within months, he became the default emergency childcare provider. His carefully planned retirement, woodworking, fishing trips, men's group meetings, all subordinated to his grandchildren's school schedules and his daughter-in-law's work commitments. The clash between his expectations and reality created profound resentment, not because he didn't love his grandchildren, but because his identity had been reduced to a resource rather than respected as a complete human being with his own trajectory. This expectation mismatch has deep roots in developmental psychology. Your children still carry unconscious imprints of you as the provider, the ever-present support system. When you live nearby, these unconscious expectations activate naturally. You revert to the provider role. They revert to the receiver role. The adult-to-adult relationship you might have developed becomes compromised. Most dangerous is the resentment risk that inevitably emerges. Unspoken obligations poison the very relationships you sought to nurture. When you're constantly available, your contributions become invisible, expected rather than appreciated. The father who babysits weekly isn't thanked. He's criticized when he's unavailable. The grandfather who helps with yard work isn't celebrated. He's subtly pressured when the hedges grow too high. Resentment is particularly toxic because it operates beneath conscious awareness. You feel it building but dismiss it as ungrateful. Your children sense your withdrawal but attribute it to aging rather than legitimate boundary defense. This mutual misunderstanding creates emotional distance despite physical proximity. What's particularly painful about this arrangement is that the love remains unchanged. You love your children, they love you, but love without appropriate structure becomes distorted. Your availability becomes obligation. Their concern becomes control. The ingredients for meaningful connection are present, but the recipe has been corrupted by misguided proximity. The fundamental error lies in conflating closeness with connection. True connection requires differentiation. The clear understanding that you are separate beings with separate lives who choose to intersect rather than merge. When proximity blurs these lines, the foundation for authentic relationship crumbles. What remains may look like connection, but lacks its essential element, freely chosen engagement between equals. The alternative framework for meaningful connection. I've seen men follow their children across continents only to discover they're more isolated than before. Physical presence does not guarantee emotional connection. In many cases, it actively prevents it. What I'm going to share now is counterintuitive but psychologically sound. The path to meaningful family relationships often requires strategic distance. The strategic distance principle operates on fundamental psychological truths about human nature. We value what isn't constantly available. We respect boundaries that are clearly defined. We engage more meaningfully when interaction requires intention rather than convenience. This isn't manipulation. It's alignment with our evolutionary wiring. Our ancestors traveled great distances to consult with elders, imbuing those consultations with significance precisely because they weren't everyday occurrences. Consider how relationships naturally develop. The most respected figures in your life likely maintained a certain distance, not emotional distance, but the space that commands reverence. Your most influential teachers, mentors, or bosses didn't make themselves constantly available. Their limited accessibility enhanced their impact. This same principle applies to your relationship with adult children. When you establish appropriate distance, you create the psychological conditions for respect. Your opinions carry more weight because they're not offered at every opportunity. Your presence becomes an event rather than a routine. Your wisdom becomes sought-after guidance rather than unsolicited advice. This transformation doesn't diminish your relationship. It elevates it to its proper place. The self-sufficient elder model represents another crucial element in this framework. Independence isn't merely a personal virtue, it's a gift to those around you. When you maintain your autonomy, you free your children from the burden of responsibility that often sours relationships in later years. You position yourself as a source of strength rather than need. I counseled a retired professor who resisted his daughter's pleas to move closer. Instead, he built a robust support system where he already lived, neighbors who checked in, services that addressed his needs, friends who provided companionship. His twice-yearly visits with his daughters contained more joy and meaningful exchange than many families who share a neighborhood experience in years. Why? Because his self-sufficiency made those visits celebrations rather than obligations. This model requires courage. It means developing new connections later in life. It means embracing technology to maintain communication. It means acknowledging your limitations without surrendering to them. The psychological fortitude this demonstrates models essential resilience for your children and grandchildren. They learn not just from your words but from your continued determination to stand firmly on your own ground. The intentional visit doctrine completes this framework. Quality connection requires planning, anticipation, and full presence. When visits are events rather than habits, both parties prepare emotionally. They clear schedules. They consider how to make the time meaningful. They enter the interaction with intention rather than obligation. Think about how differently you experience a planned dinner with old friends versus an impromptu drop-in. The planned event carries weight, expectation, and mutual commitment. You prepare topics to discuss. You reflect on the relationship. You arrive fully present. Distance between visits creates this same psychological readiness for meaningful engagement. I've observed this in my own family connections. When I travel to see relatives, the visits have definition. They have beginning, middle, and end. This temporal boundary creates a container for authentic connection that ongoing proximity rarely achieves. We make conscious choices about how to spend our limited time together rather than defaulting to routine interactions that may satisfy proximity but not genuine connection. The framework I'm describing isn't abandonment or detachment. It's the opposite. It's creating the conditions for connection that matters. It's recognizing that meaningful relationships require space to breathe, boundaries to respect, and intention to thrive. These elements often disappear when physical proximity becomes the dominant feature of your family arrangement. What I'm advocating requires discernment and courage. It means resisting the cultural narrative that aging necessitates dependency. It means making decisions based on psychological truths rather than conventional expectations. The reward, however, is family relationships characterized by mutual respect rather than unconscious resentment. And that transformation alone is worth considering an alternative to the proximity trap. I've met men who maintained their dignity into their 90s through strategic choices about where and how they lived. One gentleman in Vancouver established a life 20 miles from his children, close enough for regular visits, distant enough to preserve his sovereignty. His implementation strategy wasn't complicated, but it was deliberate. Let me outline the practical approach that makes independence viable. The community integration approach stands as your first line of defense against isolation. The modern myth suggests that family provides your only meaningful connections in later years. This is psychologically destructive nonsense. Human beings have always formed tribes beyond blood relations. Your capacity to build community doesn't diminish with age. It becomes more essential. Start with purpose-driven connections. Men bond through shared activities, not idle conversation. Join a veterans group, a woodworking club, a volunteer organization. These structured environments create natural opportunities for meaningful male friendship without the awkwardness of trying to make friends. The neurochemical response to purposeful activity alongside others creates bonds that casual interaction cannot replicate. Cultivate relationships with neighbors of various ages. The mixed-age community represents the natural human environment throughout most of history. When you interact only with age peers, you limit your perspective and opportunities. The 40-year-old neighbor who needs occasional wisdom becomes the same neighbor who checks on you after a storm. These reciprocal relationships preserve dignity because they're balanced. You remain both giver and receiver. Establish regular routines in public spaces. The barista who knows your order, the librarian who recommends books, the park regulars who save your bench. These weak ties create a social safety net that doesn't compromise your autonomy. Research shows these casual connections significantly impact well-being, sometimes more than family relationships, precisely because they come without complicated histories or expectations. The technology bridge method provides your second implementation strategy. Distance from family doesn't mean disconnection, not in this era. The senior men who thrive maintain robust digital connections without surrendering physical independence. This requires intentional skill development, not reluctant concession to modern tools. Master video calling beyond the basics. Learn to share screens, send photos during calls, and use virtual backgrounds to create conversation starters. The quality of digital interaction depends not on the technology but on how you use it. One client established a weekly workshop tour with his distant son. They'd walk through their respective projects via video, maintaining their shared passion for craftsmanship despite living in different states. Develop a comfort with text-based communication. Brief, regular text exchanges maintain ambient awareness without the commitment of calls. The grandfather who texts a single photo of his garden creates more authentic connection than an obligation-driven weekly phone call. These micro-connections maintain relationship continuity without creating dependency. Create digital family rituals that have meaning. The Sunday evening video, the virtual holiday tradition, the long-distance book club with grandchildren. These structured interactions provide focus for digital connection. Without this intention, calls become dutiful check-ins rather than meaningful engagement. The personal growth commitment forms your third implementation strategy. Continuing development isn't optional. It's the foundation of a dignified third act. Men who stagnate create the conditions for dependency. Those who continue their heroic journey command respect regardless of age. Pursue mastery in areas that interest you. Expertise doesn't require youth. It requires focused attention over time. The 78-year-old who becomes the local authority on native plant gardening creates a sustainable identity beyond family roles. This pursuit places you in the position of knowledge giver rather than care receiver, preserving the natural order that supports psychological health. Embrace physical challenges appropriate to your capacity. The body responds to demands at any age. The senior who walks daily, strengthens regularly, and maintains flexibility creates the physical foundation for continued independence. This isn't vanity, it's practical commitment to autonomy. Each physical capacity you maintain represents one less reason for concerned children to suggest closer proximity. Develop new skills that surprise others and yourself. Learning disrupts the narrative of decline. The father who takes up digital photography in his 70s challenges his children's unconscious assumptions about his capabilities. These demonstrations of continued growth preserve the respect essential for healthy intergenerational relationships. These implementation strategies aren't theoretical. They're proven approaches I've seen transform men's experience of aging. They require intention and courage, but they create the conditions for relationships based on respect rather than obligation. The alternative, drifting into dependency through proximity, offers apparent comfort at the cost of your fundamental dignity as a man. Mastering the psychological balancing act. I visited a retirement community in Arizona where I met Thomas, an 83-year-old former engineer. His children had begged him to move in with them after his wife died. He refused. Instead, he maintained his home 2 hours away, creating what he called the perfect distance. Close enough for meaningful visits, far enough to preserve what he valued most, his status as a sovereign individual. His children initially resented his choice. 5 years later, they understood its wisdom. The legacy of independence represents perhaps your most overlooked contribution to your family. When you maintain appropriate separation and self-sufficiency, you're not being stubborn, you're teaching. Every generation learns how to age by watching the previous one. Your children are taking notes, consciously or not, on how to navigate the final chapters of life. What example are you setting? Consider the psychological inheritance you're creating. The father who surrenders autonomy for convenience teaches his children that aging equals diminishment. The father who maintains independence despite challenges demonstrates that dignity transcends physical decline. This modeling matters more than any words you might speak about aging well. Your actions now are creating the template your children will likely follow decades later. This isn't abstract, it's practical legacy building. The The resilience you demonstrate today becomes the standard your children internalize for tomorrow. One client told me his greatest motivation for maintaining independence was simple. I don't want my son thinking this is how a man should end his story. The responsibility to model dignified aging provides powerful motivation to resist the comfort of proximity. The reciprocity rule offers another essential principle for maintaining balanced family relationships. Healthy connection demands mutual exchange. When proximity creates imbalance, when you become primarily the receiver rather than the giver, the fundamental dynamics of respect begin to erode. Maintaining distance preserves your capacity to give meaningfully. This giving needn't be material. Your wisdom, perspective, and experienced judgment represent valuable currencies. The grandfather who provides occasional thoughtful counsel from a position of independence offers more valuable guidance than the one who offers constant commentary from the guest room. Distance creates the psychological space for your contributions to be received as gifts rather than intrusions. Your role as elder carries responsibilities beyond simply being present. Traditional societies understood that elders must maintain a certain removal to preserve their function as wisdom keepers. Too much involvement in daily minutiae compromises perspective. The grandfather constantly negotiating family logistics cannot simultaneously provide the long-view wisdom that represents his most valuable contribution. This reciprocity extends to emotional exchange as well. You need to be more than a sounding board for your children's challenges. You need space to process your own continuing journey, to pursue your own growth, to maintain relationships outside the family system. Distance creates this capacity. Proximity often collapses it, reducing you to a supporting character in your children's narrative. The wisdom of boundaries completes this psychological balancing act. Clear boundaries don't separate you from family. They create the conditions for healthier, more meaningful connection. The father who says, "I'll visit for a week quarterly rather than move nearby," isn't rejecting his children. He's establishing the structure that preserves the essence of the relationship. These boundaries require ongoing maintenance. The children who initially accept your autonomous arrangement may press for closer proximity during health challenges or their own life transitions. Maintaining perspective during these pressure points demands psychological fortitude. The boundary you establish today will be tested tomorrow. Your commitment to that boundary determines whether your third act belongs to you or becomes an appendix to someone else's story. Remember that your children's desire for proximity often stems from genuine love and concern. Acknowledging this while maintaining boundaries requires nuance. I understand your concern and I'm touched by it. I've created systems to address these challenges while preserving what matters most to me, my independence. This response honors their intention while affirming your sovereignty. The ultimate wisdom lies in recognizing that meaningful family connection requires each member to stand firmly on their own ground. When you surrender your ground by moving too close, you don't strengthen the relationship. You fundamentally alter it, often in ways neither party fully anticipates. The father becomes the dependent. The child becomes the caretaker. The natural order that supported healthy dynamics for decades becomes inverted. What I'm advocating isn't isolation but intentional relating. It's creating the conditions where your presence carries weight, your counsel receives consideration, and your dignity remains intact. This balanced relationship serves everyone involved. Your children receive the gift of a father who continues to demonstrate strength. You receive the gift of continued purpose and autonomy. The relationship receives the gift of respect that proximity often inadvertently destroys. The proximity that seems to offer security often conceals a profound psychological trap. Your dignity as a man doesn't diminish with age unless you surrender it willingly at your children's doorstep. The choice you face isn't between isolation and dependence. It's between unconscious drift toward diminishment and conscious creation of a third act worthy of your life story. The cultural narrative pushing seniors toward their children's neighborhoods serves everyone except the elder himself. Distance isn't separation. It's the precise condition that makes genuine connection possible. Ask yourself this: are you arranging your final chapters to satisfy others' anxiety, or are you continuing to stand as the sovereign individual you've spent decades becoming? The answer will determine whether you end your journey as patriarch or dependent. Choose carefully. The legacy you leave isn't just what you give away, it's how you lived until the end.